Try not to spill anything tonight, Ethan Carlisle said without even looking at her. Some of the people in this room are worth more than entire neighborhoods. The words didn't explode across the restaurant. They slid through it slowly, cold and sharp, like a blade across silk. A few investors smirked into their whiskey glasses. Others pretended not to hear. But Naomi Brooks heard every syllable. She stood perfectly still beside the 12-foot walnut table inside Oraline, Manhattan's most exclusive private dining lounge, one hand balancing a silver tray of Bordeaux, the other tightening slightly around a linen napkin. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, rain shimmered across the city skyline, turning billions of dollars of glass towers into blurred rivers of light. Inside, the room glowed gold beneath crystal chandeliers imported from Venice. Soft jazz floated through hidden speakers. Waiters moved like ghosts between billionaires, politicians, and venture capital kings discussing numbers large enough to reshape industries. And at the center of it all sat Ethan Carlisle. 39 years old. Founder and CEO of Carlisle Dynamics. America's newest tech titan. Blonde hair swept perfectly back. Tailored charcoal suit. A platinum watch worth more than most people's annual salary. Men wanted to be him. Networks wanted interviews with him. Investors called him the future. But Naomi had worked enough nights in places like this to recognize another truth about powerful men. The louder the room admired them, the less they noticed the people standing 2 feet away. Ethan didn't look at servers when he spoke. Didn't say thank you. Didn't pause when someone reached across him to refill his drink. To him, service workers were part of the furniture. Useful when functioning correctly. Irritating when noticed. Naomi lowered the wine bottle carefully and filled the glass beside him with steady hands. She didn't react to the insult. That surprised Richard Sterling. Across the table, the 62-year-old investment chairman watched her quietly over the rim of his bourbon glass. Most people in the room feared Ethan Carlisle. Richard studied him. There was a difference. Naomi could feel the eyes around the table waiting for her to shrink. To apologize for existing too loudly in a room built for people with private jets and market influence. But she simply nodded once and said softly, "Of course, sir." Calm. Controlled. Dangerous in a way no one there understood yet. Ethan chuckled under his breath and returned to the massive presentation screen glowing behind him. "Now," he announced confidently, straightening his cufflinks, "let's talk about the deal that's going to redefine artificial intelligence in America." The room shifted immediately. Phones lowered. Investors leaned forward. Assistants opened tablets. On the screen appeared the number everyone had flown to Manhattan for. $3.5 billion. The acquisition deal between Carlisle Dynamics and Nexera Systems was already being called historic by financial media. CNBC reporters waited downstairs. Analysts predicted Ethan's net worth would double overnight if the signing succeeded. This wasn't just another business dinner. It was a coronation. And Ethan knew it. Naomi stepped backward silently toward the service station near the wall, but her eyes drifted briefly toward the spreadsheet projections glowing across the enormous LED screen. Columns. Debt ratios. Revenue forecasts. Acquisition exposure percentages. Numbers moved quickly across the display while Ethan spoke with polished confidence about innovation, disruption, and market dominance. Most people saw a billionaire presenting destiny. Naomi saw something else. A mistake. Tiny. Buried deep inside a valuation column near the projected debt conversion figures. So small almost nobody would catch it. Almost nobody except someone who used to spend sleepless nights studying financial statements on a cracked laptop beside her mother's hospital bed in Brooklyn. Naomi blinked once. Then looked again. Her heartbeat slowed instead of rising. Because the moment she realized what she was seeing, she understood something terrifying. If Ethan Carlisle signed that deal tonight, the collapse wouldn't happen in years. It would happen almost immediately. Naomi kept her face calm, but her eyes remained locked on the glowing numbers behind Ethan Carlisle as the presentation continued. The mistake was still there. Hidden inside a projected liability conversion column buried beneath pages of polished optimism and billion-dollar confidence. 1 decimal point in the wrong place. 1 manipulated debt ratio. Small enough to escape most people in the room. Big enough to destroy an entire acquisition once regulators looked closely. Around her, crystal glasses clinked softly while investors nodded along to Ethan's confident voice. Nexera gives us complete market dominance in predictive automation, he said smoothly, pacing near the LED wall like a man already celebrating victory. Within 18 months, we project a 42% increase in enterprise integration. Applause rippled politely through the private lounge. Richard Sterling did not clap. He sat still at the far end of the table, fingers resting against his bourbon glass, watching both Ethan and the waitress near the service station. Naomi lowered her gaze quickly before anyone noticed her staring at the financial projections too long. She knew how rooms like this worked. People in uniforms were expected to disappear. Smile. Pour. Leave. Thinking was reserved for people wearing $6,000 suits. A younger investor leaned toward Ethan with a grin. Wall Street is going to lose its mind tomorrow. Ethan smirked. They usually do. More laughter followed. Controlled laughter. Expensive laughter. The kind that belonged to people who never worried about overdraft fees or hospital bills. Naomi moved quietly between tables collecting empty glasses while her thoughts raced beneath the calm expression she had perfected years ago. Her mother used to call it survival silence. The ability to stay composed while life tested how much humiliation a person could carry without breaking. Naomi learned that skill early. Long subway rides from Brooklyn. Late night shifts. Community college classes squeezed between work schedules. Hospital waiting rooms that smelled like disinfectant and exhaustion. Most nights she studied finance textbooks beside her mother's treatment bed until sunrise painted pale light across the windows. Numbers became her escape. Because numbers did not care where you came from. Numbers only cared whether you were right. Ethan clicked to the next slide. Revenue projections expanded across the massive screen in glowing blue charts. Naomi stopped walking. There it was again. The same inconsistency. Worse this time. The projected acquisition debt had been artificially diluted through future earnings assumptions that could never realistically happen under current federal regulations. Her stomach tightened. This was not optimism anymore. It was recklessness disguised as genius. One of the waiters brushed past her carrying imported champagne. "You okay?" he whispered. Naomi nodded automatically. Fine. But she was not fine. Because now she faced a dangerous question. Say nothing and protect her job. Or speak and risk becoming exactly what powerful men hated most. A person beneath them who refused to stay invisible. Ethan raised his glass toward the investors. Gentlemen, by tomorrow morning, this company becomes untouchable. The skyline flashed behind him as lightning flickered faintly through the rain outside. For one strange second, the entire room looked frozen inside gold and silver reflections. Naomi watched the billionaire standing beneath the chandeliers like he owned the future itself. Then she noticed something else. Richard Sterling was no longer looking at Ethan. He was looking directly at her. Calm. Curious. As if he already knew she had seen something nobody else had. Ethan continued speaking with growing confidence. The risk exposure is minimal. Naomi almost flinched hearing the words. Minimal. It was the exact opposite. Her fingers tightened around the silver tray in her hands. She told herself to walk away. This was not her battle. Not her company. Not her money. But another voice inside her refused to stay quiet. The same voice that spent years fighting through exhaustion while richer students mocked her thrift store clothes and economics lectures. The same voice that remembered watching her mother choose between medication and rent. Integrity mattered because people suffered when powerful men lied carelessly. Ethan smiled toward the room again. Any final concerns before we moved to signatures? Silence followed. Heavy. Comfortable. Dangerous. Naomi looked down once more at the glowing spreadsheet. Then slowly lifted her eyes toward the billionaire at the front of the room. The silence stretched for 3 full seconds after Ethan Carlisle asked if anyone had concerns. 3 seconds inside a room full of billionaires felt enormous. Naomi could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning behind the walls. the distant rain tapping against the glass windows 70 floors above Manhattan. The soft crackle of ice melting inside forgotten whiskey glasses. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Because men like Ethan did not expect to be questioned once they reached the final slide. Naomi took one slow breath and stepped away from the service station. The movement was small, almost invisible, but Richard Sterling noticed immediately. His eyes narrowed slightly as she approached the edge of the massive conference table holding her silver tray against her waist like armor. Ethan glanced at her briefly, already annoyed by the interruption before she even opened her mouth. "Sir," Naomi said carefully, her voice calm enough to disappear into the jazz music if people were not already listening so closely, "I think there may be an issue with the acquisition exposure numbers on slide 14. A few heads turned instantly. One investor blinked in confusion. Another exchanged an amused smirk with the men beside him. Ethan stared at her for a moment as if his brain refused to process what had just happened. Then he laughed softly. Not genuine laughter. Performance laughter. The kind designed to remind everyone who owned the room. "An issue," he repeated slowly. "With my numbers." Naomi kept her posture straight. "Yes, sir." Ethan looked around the table, smiling wider now. "This should be interesting." A few uncomfortable chuckles followed him. Naomi could feel the heat rising beneath dozens of expensive eyes staring at her black server uniform like it had wandered into the wrong universe. She knew exactly what they saw. A waitress speaking out of turn. A service worker interrupting billion-dollar negotiations. A woman crossing invisible lines rich people spent their entire lives protecting. Ethan stepped closer to the glowing screen behind him. "Please," he said mockingly, extending one hand toward the spreadsheets. "Educate us." Richard Sterling did not laugh. Neither did the attorney seated near the end of the table. Naomi swallowed carefully, then lifted her eyes toward the projection. "Your future debt conversion ratio assumes Nexera's overseas licensing approvals will clear within 2 quarters, she explained quietly. "But under the current federal review timeline, those approvals cannot legally finalize before next fiscal year." The room changed instantly. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just enough. One attorney lowered his pen. An investor stopped typing on his phone. Ethan's smile faded almost invisibly around the edges. Naomi continued before fear could catch up to her. "That changes the projected valuation exposure by approximately 11.4%. Silence again. Heavy silence. Ethan folded his arms slowly. "And where exactly did you study corporate acquisition law?" His tone sharpened now, less amused, more irritated. Naomi answered honestly. "I studied finance at Borough Community College before leaving school." Ethan smirked immediately. Community college. The words landed with deliberate cruelty. "Fantastic. Maybe next we can ask the valet to review our legal contracts." This time several people laughed harder, relieved to follow the billionaire back toward safety and superiority. Naomi felt the humiliation move through the room like cold smoke. But she did not step back. She did not apologize. That unsettled Ethan more than disagreement ever could. Confident people expected resistance. What frightened them was composure. Richard Sterling leaned forward slightly in his chair. "Continue," he said calmly. The room quieted again. Ethan glanced toward Richard, surprised by the interruption. Naomi looked directly at the spreadsheet. If the approvals are delayed, Nexera's debt obligations increase faster than projected revenue. The acquisition becomes overleveraged almost immediately. One of the analysts near the center of the table suddenly frowned at his tablet. His fingers moved quickly across the screen. Then another investor checked the numbers independently. The atmosphere inside Oraline began shifting beneath the gold chandeliers like ice cracking under invisible pressure. Ethan noticed it too. For the first time all night, uncertainty flickered across his face. Small. Fast. But real. Naomi stood silently beside the glowing screen while powerful men recalculated the future in real time. The room no longer felt warm after that. The gold lighting still reflected across crystal glasses and polished marble walls, but something underneath the luxury had shifted. Confidence was gone. Now there was calculation. Quiet calculation. Several investors stared down at their tablets with tightening expressions while legal teams whispered behind raised hands. The soft jazz playing through Auraline's hidden speakers suddenly sounded distant, almost inappropriate against the tension building around the table. Ethan Carlyle remained near the presentation screen, but the effortless control he carried earlier was beginning to crack around the edges. "There is no issue with the projections," he said firmly, though his voice carried more force now than certainty. The debt conversion assumptions were reviewed by 3 separate legal teams. Naomi stood still beside the table, her tray lowered at her side. "The approvals are not the problem," she answered carefully. "The timing is." Ethan exhaled sharply through his nose and looked toward the attorney seated near the center of the room. "Tell her she is wrong." Nobody answered immediately. That silence lasted less than 2 seconds, but in rooms built on power, hesitation spoke louder than arguments. One attorney adjusted his glasses and looked back down at the spreadsheet on his tablet. Another quietly typed numbers into a calculator app. Richard Sterling watched all of it without moving. The billionaire investor had spent 40 years surviving Wall Street crashes, hostile takeovers, and corporate fraud investigations. He knew panic when he saw it. And right now, panic was beginning to spread beneath designer suits and polished smiles. Ethan noticed it too. "This is ridiculous," he snapped suddenly. "We are seriously stopping a $3.5 billion acquisition because a waitress took a finance class." A few nervous laughs surfaced around the room, weaker this time. Naomi felt dozens of eyes pressing against her again, waiting for embarrassment to finally silence her. But she had crossed too far already to retreat now. "I did not say the deal should stop," she replied calmly. "I said the debt exposure changes if the federal approvals miss the projected timeline." Richard finally spoke. Quietly. "By how much?" Every head in the room turned toward him. Naomi answered without hesitation. "Approximately $480 million in unprotected exposure within the first fiscal cycle." The number landed like a crack through glass. One investor muttered something under his breath. Another slowly leaned back in his chair, staring toward the giant screen as if seeing it clearly for the first time. Ethan stepped forward immediately. "That is speculation." Naomi shook her head once. "No, sir. It is arithmetic." The sentence was soft. Respectful. But devastating. For the first time all evening, Ethan Carlyle looked directly at Naomi Brooks, not as staff, not as background noise, but as a threat. Outside the towering windows, lightning flashed faintly over Manhattan, illuminating the rain streaking down the glass. Inside, the atmosphere continued tightening with every passing second. One of the younger analysts suddenly cleared his throat. Actually, his voice faltered under the pressure of the room. Ethan turned sharply toward him. "Actually what?" The analyst swallowed hard. "The exposure estimate may be accurate if the overseas licensing delay extends beyond Q2. Nobody moved after that. The words seemed to drain oxygen from the room itself. Ethan stared at the analyst in disbelief. "You reviewed these projections personally?" "Yes, sir." "And now you are questioning them because of her?" The analyst looked uncomfortable. "I am questioning the timeline assumptions." Ethan's jaw tightened visibly. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. She knew what came next in rooms like this. Powerful men rarely collapsed all at once. First came denial. Then anger. Then blame. Especially when the truth came from someone they considered beneath them. Richard Sterling slowly placed his bourbon glass onto the table. The sound was small, but everyone heard it. "Pause the signing," he said. No music. No laughter. No movement. Just silence swallowing the entire private lounge while billion-dollar confidence began collapsing under the weight of a waitress who refused to stay invisible. Nobody reached for the contracts after Richard Sterling said those 4 words. Pause the signing. The thick leather folders remained untouched beside half-finished drinks while tension spread across the room like invisible smoke. Outside, Manhattan glittered through the rain as if the city itself had no idea a $3.5 billion empire was beginning to crack 70 floors above the streets below. Ethan Carlyle forced a smile that no longer looked natural. "Richard," he said carefully, trying to recover control. With all due respect, this is becoming theatrical. Richard did not blink. No, he answered calmly. What would be theatrical is losing $500 million because nobody in this room was willing to listen to someone wearing an apron. The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Several investors immediately looked away from Naomi, embarrassed by how quickly they had dismissed her minutes earlier. Ethan's expression darkened. You cannot seriously believe she understands this deal better than my analysts. Richard folded his hands slowly. Right now, I believe she understands one critical number better than your room full of experts. Silence again. Heavy. Suffocating. Naomi stood near the glowing presentation screen wishing she could disappear from every eye staring at her. But that was the strange thing about visibility. Once powerful people finally noticed you, they either tried to elevate you or destroy you. Rarely anything in between. One of the attorneys near the center of the table finally spoke up. We should probably rerun the exposure timeline before signing anything tonight. Ethan turned sharply toward him. We already reviewed it. Yes, the attorney replied cautiously. But the federal approval assumption may not survive external audit review if the timing projections are challenged. Another investor leaned forward now, concern replacing arrogance. If regulators delay overseas licensing, what happens to the valuation floor? Nobody answered immediately. Naomi could almost feel the room recalculating billions of dollars in real time. Ethan looked furious that the conversation no longer belonged to him. He walked toward the massive screen and grabbed the presentation remote tighter than necessary. This company was built on calculated risk, he snapped. That is how innovation works. Richard Sterling's voice remained calm. Calculated risk is not the same thing as avoidable exposure. Ethan laughed once, sharp and bitter. Amazing. 20 years building a technology empire and tonight I get lectured by a waitress and a room full of cowards. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. The insult no longer surprised her. Men terrified of losing power often reached for humiliation first because it was easier than accountability. But what unsettled her now was not Ethan's anger. It was how quickly the room had stopped defending him. Earlier that evening investors leaned toward him like he was gravity itself. Now they whispered behind raised hands while legal teams quietly reviewed exit clauses on their tablets. Confidence was evaporating. Richard slowly stood from his chair. The movement alone changed the atmosphere inside Oraline. People listened when billionaires moved carefully. Tell me your name, he said, looking directly at Naomi for the first time all night. She hesitated softly. Naomi Brooks, sir. Richard nodded once. Miss Brooks, where did you learn financial analysis? Every eye returned to her. Naomi swallowed carefully before answering. Mostly on my own. Ethan shook his head in disbelief. This is absurd. But Richard ignored him completely. You noticed the exposure in less than 10 minutes? Naomi nodded faintly. Yes, sir. And nobody on my acquisition team caught it. Nobody spoke after that because everyone in the room understood what those words truly meant. Either the deal had been recklessly assembled or the room had become so hypnotized by Ethan Carlisle's reputation that nobody questioned him anymore. Both possibilities were dangerous. One investor quietly closed his folder. Another removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. The sound of rain against the windows suddenly seemed louder than the music. Ethan stared across the room watching confidence drain from faces that had admired him less than an hour earlier. And for the first time in years, he looked like a man realizing money could no longer control the direction of the room. The energy inside Oraline no longer resembled a celebration. An hour earlier the private dining lounge had sounded like victory. Expensive laughter. Crystal glasses. Billionaires discussing the future like men dividing territory on a map. Now the room felt colder. Smaller somehow. The giant skyline windows still framed Manhattan in silver rain and electric light, but the atmosphere beneath the chandeliers had changed into something sharp and uncomfortable. Doubt. Ethan Carlisle stood near the glowing presentation screen gripping the remote so tightly his knuckles had turned pale. Across the table, investors whispered quietly with legal advisors while analysts recalculated projections on tablets that suddenly seemed more important than champagne or reputation. Nobody touched the contracts anymore. Naomi Brooks remained standing near the far side of the table, still holding the silver tray she forgot to put down. She could feel her heartbeat now. Not because she regretted speaking, but because she understood what happened when powerful people started losing control in public. Richard Sterling slowly walked toward the massive LED display showing Carlyle Dynamics acquisition numbers. "Pull up the overseas licensing timeline," he said calmly. Ethan exhaled sharply. "Richard, this has already gone far enough." "Has it?" Richard asked without turning around. The room went silent again. Ethan glanced around the table searching for support, but the faces that looked back at him no longer carried admiration. They carried caution. Wall Street respected confidence until confidence threatened money. Then loyalty disappeared fast. One of the legal consultants connected his tablet to the main display. New charts appeared across the screen. Timelines. Regulatory projections. International approval schedules. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. She already knew what they were about to find. The consultant adjusted his glasses while reading silently. Then his expression changed. Slightly. But enough. "The projected approval window assumes accelerated clearance status," he admitted carefully. Richard folded his arms. "Can Nexera legally qualify for accelerated clearance?" Another pause. Another dangerous pause. "Not under current federal review guidelines," the consultant answered quietly. The room seemed to lose sound after that. Even the rain outside felt distant. Ethan stepped forward immediately. "That does not invalidate the acquisition." "No," Richard replied calmly. "But it invalidates your timeline." Several investors exchanged looks across the table. One older executive slowly closed his leather folder entirely. Another removed his company pin from his suit jacket and slipped it into his pocket as if distancing himself from the deal already. Ethan noticed every movement. His jaw tightened harder with each second. "You are all overreacting," he snapped. "The numbers still work long-term." Richard looked directly at him. "Long-term does not matter if the market destroys confidence tomorrow morning." Naomi remained silent while the room continued shifting around her. She had spent years invisible in places like this, serving men who believed intelligence wore expensive watches and private school accents. But tonight the illusion was breaking apart right in front of her. One investor finally spoke. "If this leaks publicly before restructuring, Carlyle Dynamics stock could collapse before opening bell." Another added quietly, "The media will tear this apart." Ethan laughed once, bitter and exhausted. "So now everybody is scared because a waitress noticed a spreadsheet inconsistency." Richard turned slowly toward Naomi. "No," he said. "Everybody is scared because a waitress noticed something none of us did." The sentence settled over the room heavier than any insult Ethan had thrown all night. Naomi felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. Not from pride. From something stranger. Recognition. For years she studied quietly while people dismissed her before she spoke a single word. Professors who assumed she could not keep up. Employers who smiled politely before hiring someone more polished. Customers who snapped fingers instead of saying "excuse me." Yet numbers never cared about prejudice. Truth never cared about status. Ethan looked at Naomi again, but this time the arrogance was fading behind something else. Fear. Real fear. Because for the first time in his career, the room no longer moved when he spoke. It moved around her. The collapse did not happen all at once. That was the strange thing about power. People imagined empires falling with screaming headlines and dramatic exits. But inside Oraline, beneath the soft gold chandeliers and rain-covered skyline, the downfall of Ethan Carlyle happened quietly. One investor at a time. One glance at a spreadsheet. One moment of lost confidence after another. Richard Sterling returned slowly to his seat while attorneys continued reviewing the revised exposure numbers. Nobody touched the dessert plates the staff had placed earlier. The untouched chocolate soufflés and imported strawberries sat forgotten beneath dim candlelight while billion-dollar calculations swallowed the room whole. Ethan remained standing near the presentation screen, but now he looked isolated against the giant wall of glowing financial projections behind him. A king slowly realizing the room no longer believed in the crown. "We can restructure the timeline," Ethan said sharply, trying to reclaim momentum. "This acquisition is still the strongest strategic move on the market." One investor shook his head. "Maybe next quarter." Another added quietly, "Not with this exposure hanging over it." Ethan's expression hardened further. "You are all acting like this company is unstable." Richard looked at him carefully before answering. "No. We are acting like confidence is fragile." The sentence settled heavily over the room. Wall Street ran on numbers, but numbers alone never moved markets. Belief did. The second belief cracked, everything else followed behind it. Naomi Brooks stood near the edge of the lounge wishing she could return to invisibility. She never intended to become the center of a billionaire negotiation. She only saw a mistake and spoke because staying silent felt wrong. But now every eye in the room carried a different expression when they looked at her. Some embarrassed. Some impressed. Some uncomfortable that the smartest financial observation of the night came from someone they ignored while ordering wine. One of the younger executives suddenly frowned toward his phone. "Oh no." The words barely rose above a whisper, but everyone heard them. Ethan turned immediately. "What?" The executive hesitated before slowly rotating the screen toward the table. A short video clip was already spreading online. Grainy cell phone footage from earlier that evening. Ethan's voice. Cold. Condescending. "Some of the people in this room are worth more than entire neighborhoods." The room went still. Completely still. Naomi felt her stomach tighten. Someone at the dinner had recorded the humiliation from the beginning. Beneath the video, comments and reposts were multiplying by the second. Investors exchanged uneasy looks. Public relations advisors immediately reached for phones. Ethan stared at the screen in disbelief. Who posted that? Nobody answered because the question no longer mattered. The internet had already done what it always did. It chose a villain. Richard Sterling watched the video silently before setting the phone back onto the table. "This," he said quietly, "is why character matters in business." Ethan laughed bitterly. "Character?" His voice rose now, frustration cracking through the polished billionaire image. "I built a multi-billion-dollar company from nothing." Richard nodded once. "And tonight a waitress protected it from disaster while you insulted her in front of half of Manhattan's financial elite." Nobody defended Ethan after that. Not one person. The silence felt almost surgical. Precise. Final. One investor closed his folder and stood up first. Then another followed. Chairs shifted softly across marble floors while billionaires prepared to leave the deal behind. Ethan looked around the room. As realization finally settled over him completely. The acquisition was dead. Not because of one spreadsheet error alone. Not because of one delayed approval timeline. But because the room no longer trusted the man leading it. Naomi slowly lowered her eyes as guests gathered coats and phones. Outside the windows, New York continued glowing beneath the rain, completely unaware that inside one luxury dining room, power had changed hands without a single person raising their voice. By the time the first investors stepped into the private elevators, the atmosphere inside Oraline no longer felt like a business dinner. It felt like the final minutes after a storm. Quiet. Heavy. Uncomfortable in ways expensive rooms were never designed to handle. Half-empty wine glasses remained untouched beside abandoned contract folders while Manhattan shimmered through the rain beyond the towering windows. The city outside kept moving. Taxi lights flowed through wet streets. Helicopters blinked faintly above the skyline. Somewhere below, people laughed in crowded bars, completely unaware that one of the largest technology acquisitions of the year had just collapsed upstairs in near silence. Ethan Carlyle stood motionless near the center of the lounge, watching people leave him behind one by one. No speeches now. No applause. No confidence. Only phones glowing in hands as public relations teams scrambled to contain the disaster spreading online faster every minute. The video clip had already crossed financial media accounts. Headlines began appearing across investor feeds before anyone officially announced the deal was paused. Billionaire CEO humiliates Waitress before acquisition disaster. Wall Street analysts reposted the footage beside screenshots of Carlyle Dynamics stock predictions. Comment sections exploded with outrage, mockery, and disbelief. Ethan stared at one of the screens with a look Naomi had never seen on a powerful man before. Helplessness. Real helplessness. Richard Sterling buttoned his suit jacket calmly before turning toward the remaining executives at the table. "This meeting is over," he announced. Nobody argued. Attorneys quietly packed laptops into leather briefcases. Analysts avoided eye contact as they moved toward the elevators. The loyalty that once surrounded Ethan like armor had vanished almost instantly. That was another truth Naomi learned long ago. Power looked permanent until fear entered the room. Then people protected themselves first. Ethan finally looked toward Naomi again. His expression carried exhaustion now more than arrogance. "You should be happy," he said bitterly. Naomi blinked softly, caught off guard by the comment. "Sir." Ethan gestured toward the emptying room. "You made your point." Naomi tightened her grip slightly around the silver tray still resting in her hands. "I was not trying to embarrass you." Ethan laughed once under his breath. "Really?" "Because that is exactly what happened." Richard Sterling stopped near the elevator doors and looked back at them both. "No," he said quietly. "What embarrassed you was believing intelligence only exists inside people who look like you." The words cut through the lounge sharper than shouting ever could. Ethan looked away immediately toward the rain-streaked windows. Naomi remained silent because deep down she understood something painful about moments like this. Humiliation did not truly begin when people insulted you. It began when the world finally forced them to see you clearly after spending years pretending you were invisible. One of the restaurant managers hurried nervously toward Naomi. "Miss Brooks," he whispered urgently, "reporters are already downstairs asking questions." Naomi's stomach tightened instantly. She had not thought that far ahead. She was not trying to become viral. She only spoke because silence would have hurt people. But now cameras waited downstairs while social media turned her into a symbol overnight. Richard studied her carefully for a moment. "Do not let this city turn you into a headline," he said calmly. "Most people here will only care about the story for 48 hours. What matters is what comes after." Naomi nodded quietly. The remaining guests disappeared into elevators while staff members slowly cleared untouched dishes from the massive table. Ethan Carlyle remained standing alone near the darkened presentation screen watching his empire crack in real time across glowing phone displays. No one approached him anymore. No one reassured him. The room that once revolved around his voice had become painfully quiet. Naomi looked at him one last time before turning toward the service hallway. And for the first time all night, Ethan did not look like the most powerful man in the room. He looked like someone finally understanding that respect and fear were never the same thing. The rain had stopped by the time Naomi Brooks stepped out of Oraline just after midnight. Manhattan glistened beneath streetlights and passing headlights, the sidewalks reflecting gold and silver like the city itself had been polished clean by the storm. A cold breeze moved between the skyscrapers while reporters crowded behind velvet ropes near the front entrance of the building, cameras raised toward every executive leaving the private dinner upstairs. Naomi kept her head down as she slipped quietly through the side employee exit wearing the same black uniform she started the night in. No limousine waited for her. No bodyguards. No headlines announcing her arrival. Just a tired woman walking toward the subway with sore feet and a mind still struggling to understand how her entire life had shifted in a matter of hours. Her phone buzzed nonstop inside her apron pocket. Unknown numbers. News requests. Social media notifications multiplying faster than she could process them. One video alone had already passed 3 million views before midnight. She ignored all of it. Because none of those people knew the real version of her life. They did not see the overdue medical bills folded beside her kitchen sink. They did not see the nights she fell asleep beside finance textbooks while balancing double shifts and hospital visits. They only saw the viral moment. The polished story. The waitress who embarrassed a billionaire. But Naomi never wanted revenge. She only wanted truth to matter. Down in the financial district, lights still burned inside the offices of Carlyle Dynamics while crisis teams worked through the night. Market analysts predicted massive losses by morning. Investors were already distancing themselves publicly from the acquisition. And somewhere above the city skyline, Ethan Carlyle sat alone inside his penthouse office staring at the same video clip replaying endlessly across every business network in America. Not the spreadsheet correction. Not the collapsed deal. The moment that haunted him most was simpler than that. Naomi standing perfectly calm while he mocked her in front of an entire room. He had spent years believing power meant controlling people. Tonight he learned something different. True power belonged to the person who remained composed when humiliation would have broken someone else. The next morning, Naomi arrived at her mother's apartment in Brooklyn carrying coffee and bagels before sunrise. The old elevator inside the building still rattled loudly between floors like it always had. Nothing there looked different. Same peeling paint. Same flickering hallway lights. Same tiny kitchen table stacked with unopened mail. Her mother looked up from the couch as Naomi entered quietly. "You are on television," she said softly. Naomi laughed under her breath for the first time in hours. "I know." Her mother studied her carefully. "Are you okay?" Naomi paused before answering honestly. "I think so." The older woman smiled gently and reached for her hand. "Good. Because none of those rich people get to decide your worth anymore." Naomi lowered her eyes for a second, emotional in a way she had not allowed herself to feel all night. Later that afternoon, a black SUV stopped outside the apartment building. Richard Sterling stepped out alone wearing a dark overcoat against the cold wind. Neighbors peeked through curtains as one of the most powerful investors on Wall Street walked up cracked concrete steps toward a small Brooklyn apartment no billionaire would have noticed yesterday. Naomi opened the door carefully, surprised. Richard held out a thin leather folder. "I would like you to come work for Sterling Capital," he said calmly. Naomi stared at him in silence. Richard smiled faintly. "Not because you embarrassed a wealthy man. Because you protected people from a terrible decision when staying quiet would have been easier." Naomi looked down at the folder in her hands. A real offer. A real salary. A future she stopped believing existed years ago. Richard turned to leave, then paused near the stairwell. "Miss Brooks," he said quietly, "rooms like that one upstairs will always be full of people who confuse money with value. Do not become one of them." Naomi watched him disappear down the stairs while the city outside continued moving through another ordinary New York afternoon. Taxis honked. Trains rattled beneath the streets. Somewhere downtown, financial empires kept rising and falling. But inside that small Brooklyn apartment, one truth remained louder than all of it. The richest person in the room had never been the man holding the billion-dollar deal. It was the woman who refused to lose her dignity when everyone expected her to.